Montana Territory, 1872. Winter was settling over the Bitterroot Valley with a vengeance that only the untamed West could summon. Snow had already claimed the mountain passes, and the winds carried whispers of a season harsher than most. It was no time for a lone soul to be wandering these parts, especially not a woman left behind. Isaac Anderson pulled his collar higher against the biting wind and squinted at the horizon. At 25, he'd spent enough winters on the range to recognize when nature was preparing to unleash her fury. His stallion, Thunder, snorted impatiently beneath him, breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Isaac's weathered leather gloves gripped the reins tighter as he scanned the white expanse before him. "Easy, boy," he murmured, patting Thunder's neck. "We'll find shelter soon enough." Isaac had spent the past 3 years riding the open range, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to form attachments. He told himself it was the cowboy way, freedom called louder than hearth and home. The truth, though he'd never admit it aloud, was that he believed love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. The frontier demanded everything from a man: his sweat, his blood, sometimes his life. Relationships were just another vulnerability in a land that exploited weakness. His father's dying words still echoed in his mind. "This land takes more than it gives, son, remember that." Since burying his parents after a raid on their homestead, Isaac had lived by that creed: keep moving, trust no one completely, survive. The life of a drifting cowhand suited him well enough. He was respected for his skill with horses and cattle, and ranch owners were always willing to hire a man who could break the wildest bronc or track strays through the roughest country. But as another Christmas approached, his fourth alone, he couldn't ignore the hollow feeling that expanded in his chest each night as he laid his bedroll under the stars. What Isaac wanted was simple: enough money to buy a small spread of his own someday, where he could raise horses away from the complications of town life and human entanglements. What he refused to acknowledge was his need for something more fundamental: connection, purpose beyond mere survival, perhaps even a family to fill the silence. The waning afternoon light cast long shadows across the snow when Isaac spotted something unusual in the distance. A wagon, seemingly abandoned, listing to one side near a copse of pine trees. Instinct told him to ride on. Another man's troubles weren't his concern, but something made him guide Thunder toward the stranded vehicle. As he approached, he noticed tracks in the snow, the unmistakable wheel marks of a wagon train heading west, already half covered by fresh powder. This wagon had clearly been left behind, probably broken axle, he thought. Happens often enough with those heavily laden emigrant wagons. The abandoned wagon looked to have been partially unloaded, with some crates and barrels still visible beneath a hastily secured tarp. Isaac circled the vehicle, searching for signs of its occupants. That's when he heard it, a faint cough coming from inside the wagon's canvas cover. In one fluid motion, Isaac dismounted and drew his Colt revolver. "Who's there?" he called, approaching cautiously. "Show yourself." The wagon's cover rustled and a young woman emerged, wrapped in a worn woolen blanket. Her face was pale, with high cheekbones tinged pink from the cold, and her blonde hair fell in tangled waves past her shoulders. Despite her disheveled appearance, Isaac was struck by her beauty, and by the rifle she had pointed directly at his chest. "That's far enough, stranger," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the visible trembling of her hands. "State your business." Isaac slowly holstered his pistol and raised his hands. "No harm intended, miss. Just saw the wagon and thought to check if anyone needed assistance." The young woman's blue eyes narrowed with suspicion, but the rifle lowered slightly. "I don't need charity. The wagon train will be coming back for me once they reach the next settlement and can spare a team." Isaac glanced at the sky, then back at the tracks already disappearing under fresh snow. "How long have you been waiting?" 3 days, she admitted reluctantly. "The axle broke. They couldn't spare another wagon, not with winter coming on. The wagon master promised to send help once they reached Fort Benton." Isaac didn't voice the thought that crossed his mind, that Fort Benton was still at least a week's journey away, and with this weather, any rescue party would be facing treacherous conditions. Instead, he studied the broken axle and the woman's increasingly desperate situation. "I'm Isaac Anderson," he offered, removing his hat briefly. "I work cattle for the Double Diamond Ranch about 15 miles east of here." Her rifle lowered further, though wariness remained in her eyes. "Marguerite Montgomery, most people call me Maggie," she paused, seeming to debate how much to share. "My father died 2 months ago on the trail, fever took him. I was continuing on to Oregon with the Wilkerson family." Isaac nodded, understanding filling in the gaps. A lone woman with no family would be a burden on a wagon train pushing to beat winter through the mountain passes. They'd left her promising help that might never come, or at least not in time. "Miss Montgomery, I don't mean to alarm you, but there's a storm brewing, a bad one from the looks of it." He gestured to the darkening sky. "That wagon won't provide enough shelter, and your fire's too small to keep you warm through the night. What do you suggest, Mr. Anderson? That I abandon everything I own and trust a stranger?" Despite her defiance, fear flickered across her features. Isaac considered his options. The nearest town was 2 days' ride. His own cabin was remote, but at least it offered solid walls and a proper hearth. The proper thing would be to escort her to town, but with the approaching storm. "I have a small cabin," he said finally. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry. We can return for your belongings after the storm passes." Maggie's grip tightened on her rifle. "And I'm to trust that your intentions are honorable." "I wasn't born yesterday, Mr. Anderson." Isaac sighed, pushing back his hat. "Miss Montgomery, I understand your caution, but that storm will hit before midnight, and when it does, you'll be facing temperatures that can kill. I'm offering shelter, nothing more. You can keep your rifle trained on me the whole ride if it makes you feel safer." For a long moment, Maggie seemed to weigh her options, looking from Isaac to the darkening sky and back to the broken wagon that held everything she owned in the world. Finally, her shoulders sagged slightly. "Let me gather a few essentials," she said, disappearing back into the wagon. When she emerged minutes later, she wore a heavy coat over a simple blue dress, a small bundle clutched under one arm, the rifle still in her other hand. Isaac helped her secure the wagon as best they could, covering the remaining supplies with the tarp and weighing it down with rocks. "We'll return as soon as weather permits," he promised, then helped her mount Thunder before swinging up behind her. Maggie sat stiffly, maintaining as much distance as possible on the saddle they shared. Isaac respected her boundaries, keeping his hands on the reins and nothing more. As they rode eastward, the first fat snowflakes began to fall. "I hope you're a man of your word, Mr. Anderson," Maggie said over her shoulder, her voice nearly lost in the rising wind. "About the only thing I have left in this world is my word, Miss Montgomery," Isaac replied. "And I don't give it lightly." The journey to Isaac's cabin took longer than usual with the worsening weather and the double burden on Thunder. By the time the small log structure came into view, snow was falling steadily and darkness had enveloped the landscape. Isaac felt Maggie shiver against him despite her determination to maintain distance. His cabin sat in a small clearing, sheltered by pines on 3 sides. It was modest, just one room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves lined with essential supplies. A small lean-to served as both stable and storage. After seeing to Thunder, Isaac pushed open the cabin door and quickly set about lighting a fire in the cold hearth. Maggie stood awkwardly near the doorway, still clutching her bundle, eyes taking in every detail of the sparse dwelling. "It's not much," Isaac acknowledged, "but it keeps the elements out." "You live here alone?" she asked, finally stepping further into the room as warmth began to emanate from the growing fire. "Just me and Thunder," he confirmed. "Been here about 2 years now when I'm not out with the cattle." As the cabin warmed, Isaac busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and coffee. He was acutely aware of Maggie watching his every move, the rifle never far from her reach. When the food was ready, he filled 2 tin plates and set them on the table. "You'll take the bed," he said matter-of-factly. "I'll make do by the fire." Maggie looked from the narrow bed to Isaac and back again. "I couldn't possibly." "It's settled," he interrupted. I've slept on harder ground than this floor plenty of times." They ate in silence, the howling wind outside growing fiercer by the minute. Isaac stole occasional glances at his unexpected guest. In the firelight, he could see that beneath the trail dust and weariness, Maggie Montgomery was perhaps 21 or 22, with delicate features that belied the determination in her eyes. She ate sparingly, back straight, movements precise, a lady fallen on hard circumstances, not born to the frontier. "Where are you from originally, Miss Montgomery?" he asked, breaking the silence. Maggie hesitated before answering. "Boston. My father was a professor of literature until his investments failed. He believed Oregon offered a chance to start again." Her voice caught slightly. "He didn't live to see if he was right." "I'm sorry about your father," Isaac said quietly. "What about you, Mr. Anderson? You don't strike me as Montana-born and bred." Isaac poked at the fire. "Illinois, came west with my parents when I was 16. They homesteaded not far from here." He didn't elaborate on their fate, and Maggie didn't press. After dinner, Isaac fashioned a pallet near the fire while Maggie reluctantly took the bed, still fully clothed and with her rifle close at hand. As the storm raged outside, blowing snow occasionally finding its way down the chimney to hiss in the flames, Isaac stared at the ceiling beams. The cabin that had always seemed sufficient suddenly felt different with another person breathing the same air. "Mr. Anderson," Maggie's voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes. Thank you for not leaving me out there." Isaac turned toward her voice, though he could see only her silhouette in the dim firelight. "Get some rest, Miss Montgomery. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Morning brought no reprieve from the storm. If anything, it had intensified overnight, with snowdrifts piling against the cabin walls and visibility reduced to mere yards. Isaac stepped outside briefly to tend to thunder in the lean-to, returning with frost clinging to his beard and eyebrows. "I'm afraid we're snowed in for the time being," he announced, stamping his boots by the door. "Could be a day or two before it clears enough to travel." Maggie stood by the window, watching the whirling white landscape. "The wagon, my things." "They'll keep under that tarp," Isaac assured her. "Snow's a decent preserver of most goods." The confinement of the small cabin created an unexpected intimacy. As the day progressed, they established a cautious routine. Isaac showed Maggie where he kept his supplies, and she took over the cooking, producing a surprisingly flavorful stew from his limited pantry. They spoke little but moved around each other with increasing ease, like dancers learning a new pattern. By evening, Maggie had set aside the rifle, though Isaac noticed she kept it within reach. Progress of a sort. As they sat before the fire, Isaac found himself telling her about his life on the range, the cattle drives, the camaraderie of cowboys, the beauty of Montana's changing seasons. In turn, Maggie shared stories of Boston's cobblestone streets and her father's library filled with leather-bound books. "He wanted me to be educated, even though I'm a woman," she explained, a rare smile softening her features. "Said a mind shouldn't be wasted, regardless of whether it belonged to a man or woman." "Sounds like a forward-thinking man," Isaac commented. "He was, which made losing everything that much harder for him." Her smile faded. "The journey west broke his spirit before it took his body." Isaac studied her face in the firelight, "But not yours." Maggie looked up, meeting his gaze directly for perhaps the first time. "Not yet, Mr. Anderson. Though I admit, being abandoned by the wagon train tested my resolve." "Isaac," he said suddenly, "if we're to be trapped together by this storm, you might as well use my given name." A hesitant smile. "Then you must call me Maggie. Miss Montgomery makes me feel like a schoolmarm." Isaac returned her smile, feeling a strange warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. "Maggie it is." The storm continued for 3 days, during which the small cabin became a world unto itself. Isaac taught Maggie how to play poker using dried beans as chips, and she recited poetry from memory that her father had taught her. They discovered shared tastes in certain foods and common views on many subjects, from politics to the proper way to make coffee. On the third night, as they sat side by side watching the fire, Maggie asked the question Isaac had been avoiding. What happened to your parents, Isaac? You never speak of them. Isaac's hands stilled on the piece of leather he'd been working. Raid. 4 years ago, group of outlaws looking for easy pickings found our homestead. I was away working cattle at a neighboring ranch. He swallowed hard. By the time I returned, there wasn't much left to bury. Maggie's hand covered his, warm and unexpected. I'm sorry. Been on my own since, he continued, not moving his hand from beneath hers. Figured it was safer that way. No attachments means nothing to lose. That sounds terribly lonely, she observed softly. Isaac looked down at their hands, then up to meet her eyes. Never thought much about it until recently. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Maggie slowly withdrew her hand, a flush rising to her cheeks. It's getting late, she murmured. That night, lying on his pallet by the fire, Isaac stared at the ceiling and acknowledged something he'd been fighting since finding Maggie by that abandoned wagon. The wall he'd built around his heart had developed its first significant crack. On the morning of the fourth day, they awoke to silence. The wind had died during the night, and pale sunlight filtered through the frosted window panes. Isaac opened the door to find the world transformed into a glistening white expanse, the snow nearly waist-deep in places. We can try for town today, he said over breakfast. The trail will be hard going, but Thunder can manage with both of us. Maggie looked up from her coffee, something like disappointment flashing across her features before she composed herself. What about my wagon, my belongings? We should check on it first, Isaac agreed. Though I doubt we can move it until the snow melts some. They set out mid-morning, Isaac breaking trail ahead of Thunder, who carried Maggie. The cold was intense but bearable in the stillness that followed the storm. They rode mostly in silence, each lost in private thoughts about what would happen once they reached town. When they arrived at the wagon site, Isaac's heart sank. The tarp had partially blown free, and while most of Maggie's possessions appeared intact, some crates were damaged and snow had penetrated the wagon's interior. Maggie dismounted and waded through the snow to inspect the damage, her face falling as she sorted through her belongings. So much ruined, she murmured, lifting a snow-dampened quilt that had been her mother's. Isaac examined the broken axle more thoroughly. The wood split clean through. Even if we could dig it out now, this wagon won't go anywhere without major repairs. Maggie stood in the snow, clutching the damp quilt, looking suddenly small and vulnerable against the vast white landscape. Everything I have left of my old life is in this wagon, she said, her voice tight with unshed tears. Isaac moved to stand beside her. We can salvage what's important, he said gently. Pack it on Thunder, the rest. We can come back for it when conditions improve. And then what? Maggie asked, turning to face him. I have no money for repairs, no family waiting in Oregon, no prospects. Isaac hesitated, then voiced the thought that had been forming since that first night in the cabin. You could stay, at least until spring. Her eyes widened. Stay with you, what would people think? To hell with what people think, Isaac said with unexpected force. You need shelter, I have it, it's as simple as that. But they both knew it wasn't simple at all. Something had changed between them during those storm-bound days, a connection neither had sought but both had begun to value. We should take what we can and head to town, Maggie finally said. I can seek employment there while deciding my next steps. Isaac nodded, though disappointment settled heavily in his chest. They spent the next hour carefully selecting items to salvage: clothing, personal mementos, a few books, and practical necessities. The heavier furniture and household goods would have to wait. As Isaac secured the last bundle to Thunder's saddle, Maggie took one last look at the wagon that had carried her hopes across half a continent. I suppose some dreams aren't meant to be realized, she said quietly. Or perhaps they just take different forms than we expect, Isaac replied. The ride to town took the remainder of the daylight hours. Leavenworth was little more than a wide spot in the trail. A general store, saloon, small hotel, livery stable, and a handful of houses clustered around a dusty main street, now blanketed in snow. Despite its modest size, the town buzzed with activity as they arrived, with people out clearing paths between buildings. Isaac helped Maggie dismount in front of the hotel, a two-story clapboard building that served as the town's social center. Mrs. Bailey, the proprietress, emerged at their approach, her ample figure blocking the doorway. "Isaac Anderson, haven't seen you in town for months, and who might this young lady be?" Her shrewd eyes took in Maggie's travel-worn appearance and the possessions strapped to Thunder's back. "Mrs. Bailey, this is Miss Marguerite Montgomery. She was separated from her wagon train during the storm and needs accommodations." Mrs. Bailey's expression softened slightly. "Poor dear. We've heard about that train, made it to Fort Benton just before the worst hit. They mentioned having to leave someone behind." She looked Maggie up and down. "Room's $2 a week, meals included." Maggie's face paled. Isaac knew without asking that she didn't have even that modest sum. Before she could speak, he reached into his pocket and extracted several coins. "This should cover 2 weeks," he said, pressing them into Mrs. Bailey's hand. "Isaac, no," Maggie protested. "You can repay me when you're settled," he said firmly. To Mrs. Bailey he added, "Miss Montgomery is a lady of refinement. She's experienced misfortune but deserves respect." Mrs. Bailey pocketed the money with a knowing look between them. "Of course, we'll see she's comfortable, though work is scarce this time of year for a young woman." "I can teach," Maggie offered quickly. "Reading, writing, arithmetic. I was educated in Boston." Mrs. Bailey looked thoughtful. "Town's been talking about starting a proper school. Until then, some families might pay for private lessons." She gestured toward the door. "Come in, get warm, we'll sort it all out." Maggie turned to Isaac, uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed, just," he hesitated. "I'll check on you tomorrow, see how you're faring." She nodded, then impulsively reached out to squeeze his hand. "Until tomorrow, then." Isaac watched her disappear into the hotel, then led Thunder toward the livery stable, his thoughts in turmoil. He had planned to purchase supplies and return to his cabin immediately, but now found himself reluctant to leave town knowing Maggie was here. At the general store, Isaac gathered his usual provisions while the proprietor, Samuel Wells, filled him in on town gossip. "Heard you brought in that girl from the abandoned wagon," Wells said, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "Folks are already talking." Isaac's jaw tightened. "She's a respectable woman who met with misfortune." "Nothing more to say." Wells raised his eyebrows. "Didn't mean nothing by it, just that Mrs. Bailey's already put the word out about her teaching skills. Mercer family's interested, and the Harrises too." Relief replaced Isaac's defensiveness. "Good, she's educated. Deserves better than being stranded out here." "Speaking of stranded," Wells continued, "that wagon train sent word they're sending someone back for her after winter, come spring thaw." The news shouldn't have bothered Isaac, but he felt an unexpected pang at the thought of Maggie continuing westward come spring. "Did they now?" he said noncommittally. After securing his supplies and spending an uncomfortable night in the livery loft, he'd never been one for town accommodations. Isaac found himself outside the hotel early the next morning. He hesitated, suddenly unsure of his place in Maggie's life now that she was safely delivered to civilization. Before he could decide whether to enter, the door swung open and Maggie herself emerged, wearing a borrowed dress that was slightly too large for her slender frame. Her face brightened at the sight of him. "Isaac, I was hoping to see you before you left." "How did you know I was leaving?" he asked. She smiled. "Because you look about as comfortable in town as a wild horse in a corral, Mrs. Bailey says you never stay longer than one night." Isaac couldn't help returning her smile. "She knows me too well. How are you settling in?" "Better than expected. I've already arranged to teach the Mercer children 3 afternoons a week, and Mrs. Harris wants me to give her daughter piano lessons on her new parlor organ." She looked genuinely pleased. "It's not much, but it's a start." "That's good news," Isaac said, ignoring the conflicted feelings her quick adaptation stirred in him. "I'm glad things are working out." Maggie studied his face. "You're going back to your cabin today, aren't you?" He nodded. "Got supplies loaded. Best get back before the next storm hits." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with words neither seemed ready to speak. "Mr. Wells mentioned the wagon train sent word," Isaac finally said. "They'll come for you in spring." Something flickered in Maggie's eyes. "Yes, Mrs. Bailey told me. The Wilkersons felt terrible about leaving me. They want to honor their commitment to my father." "So you'll continue to Oregon?" The question felt heavier than it should have. Maggie looked away. "I suppose. It's what father wanted." She hesitated. "Although I'm beginning to wonder if Montana might hold opportunities I hadn't considered." Hope rose unbidden in Isaac's chest, but he tamped it down. "Town's a good place for a woman alone." "Safer than my remote cabin, that's certain." "Yes, safer." She didn't sound entirely convinced. Another silence stretched between them, filled with the bustle of the awakening town. "I should go," Isaac said finally. "Weather looks to be turning again." "Of course," Maggie straightened, composing herself. "Thank you again for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." "Anyone would have done the same," he demurred. "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone, not in this territory." She impulsively reached out and touched his arm. "Will you come to town again, soon?" Isaac looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then met her gaze. "I typically come in for supplies every few weeks." "Christmas is in 3 weeks," she said. "The town is planning a celebration at the hotel. Perhaps you might attend." Isaac had spent the last 3 Christmases alone by his fire, determinedly ignoring the holiday that only emphasized his solitude. The thought of facing the entire town's merrymaking held little appeal, but the thought of seeing Maggie again was another matter. "Perhaps," he said noncommittally. Her hand fell away from his arm, disappointment briefly crossing her features before she smiled brightly. "Well, good day then, Mr. Anderson. Safe travels." The formality stung more than it should have. "Good day, Miss Montgomery." The ride back to his cabin felt longer than usual, despite the clear weather. Isaac found himself replaying every conversation with Maggie, analyzing her expressions, questioning his own actions. By the time the familiar log structure came into view, he had talked himself into and out of a dozen different conclusions. The cabin, which had always represented security and independence to Isaac, now seemed somehow emptier than before. The silence, once comforting, felt oppressive. He built a fire, prepared a solitary meal, and tried to recapture the contentment he'd known before finding Maggie Montgomery in that abandoned wagon. Days passed, falling into the familiar rhythm of winter ranch work, caring for thunder, repairing tack, hunting when weather permitted, reading dog-eared books by firelight. Yet Isaac found himself glancing more frequently at the calendar nailed beside the door, watching December's days march inexorably toward Christmas. 10 days after leaving Maggie in town, Isaac was chopping wood when he heard an approaching rider. His hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip. Visitors were rare, especially in winter, and not always welcome. He relaxed slightly when he recognized Samuel Wells's son Timothy on his pinto pony. "Mr. Anderson," the boy called, waving enthusiastically. "Got a letter for you." Isaac frowned as he took the folded paper. "Who'd be writing me?" Timothy shrugged. "Pretty lady at the hotel gave it to Pa to deliver. I volunteered since I was heading this way to check our trap lines." He looked hopefully at Isaac's cabin. "Got any coffee brewing?" "It's mighty cold riding." Isaac nodded absently, his attention on the letter bearing his name in an elegant hand he didn't recognize. "Come in and warm up." While the boy gratefully accepted a mug of strong coffee, Isaac unfolded the letter and read. "Dear Isaac, I hope this letter finds you well. Leavenworth has been most welcoming, and I find myself with regular teaching duties that will soon allow me to repay your kindness. The Mercer children are bright and eager to learn, and even some adults have approached me about reading lessons in the evenings. Mrs. Bailey mentioned that you rarely participate in town gatherings, but I wanted to personally invite you to the Christmas celebration. The town has been most generous in including me in their preparations, but I find myself thinking often of our conversations by your fire during the storm. Perhaps it is forward of me to say so, but I miss your company. If you should decide to attend the celebration, I would be most pleased to see you there. with sincere regards. Marguerite Montgomery. Isaac read the letter twice more, his coffee cooling forgotten beside him. Timothy watched curiously as emotions played across the normally stoic cowboy's face. "Must be important news," the boy observed. Isaac carefully refolded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "Important enough. When do you head back to town?" "Day after tomorrow. Pa needs those furs I'm collecting." Isaac nodded thoughtfully. "I might ride along with you." Timothy's eyes widened. "Really? Pa said you never come to town except for supplies." "Things change," Isaac said simply, surprising himself with the truth of those words. 2 days later, Isaac found himself riding beside Timothy toward Leavenworth, a decision he still couldn't fully explain to himself. He'd packed more carefully than usual, including his one good shirt and the silver pocket watch that had been his father's, items rarely used in his solitary existence. As they approached town, Isaac was struck by the transformation. Despite the snow and cold, Leavenworth had embraced the Christmas spirit with evergreen boughs decorating storefronts and candles glowing in windows. The hotel in particular was festooned with ribbons and pine branches, and the sounds of a piano drifted through its walls. "Whole town's excited for the Christmas party," Timothy explained. "Miss Montgomery's been teaching the children songs to perform, and Mrs. Bailey's been baking for days." Isaac nodded, suddenly acutely aware of his rough appearance and simple clothes. What was he thinking, coming to a town celebration? He belonged in the solitude of his cabin, not among townspeople making merry. Before he could reconsider, the hotel door opened and Maggie herself stepped onto the porch. She wore a dark green dress that complemented her fair complexion, and her blonde hair was arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She was speaking with Mrs. Mercer, but her gaze drifted toward the approaching riders, and Isaac saw the exact moment she recognized him. Her entire face transformed with a smile that seemed to illuminate her from within. She excused herself from Mrs. Mercer and moved to the edge of the porch, one hand raised in greeting. All Isaac's doubts evaporated in the warmth of that smile. He dismounted, suddenly conscious of his trailed dust and unshaven face, and approached the steps. "Mr. Anderson," Maggie said formally, though her eyes conveyed a more personal welcome. "What a pleasant surprise." "Miss Montgomery," he returned, removing his hat, "I received your letter. And it persuaded you to brave town society." "I'm flattered." There was a teasing lilt to her voice that he hadn't heard before. "Seemed worth the discomfort," he admitted, holding her gaze. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "You must be tired from your journey, Mrs. Bailey has rooms available." Isaac nodded. "I should see to Thunder first, then make myself presentable." "The celebration begins at 7, Maggie informed him. "I look forward to seeing you there." As Isaac led Thunder toward the livery, he caught Samuel Wells watching the exchange with undisguised interest. News of his arrival, and his interaction with the town's new schoolteacher, would spread faster than wildfire. Let them talk, Isaac thought with uncharacteristic disregard for others' opinions. He'd spent too long living by his father's cautious creed, too many years believing attachments were weaknesses to be avoided. Maggie's letter, with its simple admission that she missed his company, had cracked something open inside him that couldn't be resealed. After settling Thunder and securing a room at the hotel, ignoring Mrs. Bailey's knowing smile, Isaac made use of the bathhouse behind the barber shop, shaving carefully and donning his clean clothes. The man who stared back at him from the small mirror looked younger, less weathered than the reflection he was accustomed to seeing in his cabin's water bucket. By 7 o'clock, the hotel's main room was transformed. Tables had been pushed aside to create space for dancing, pine boughs and red ribbons decorated every available surface, and candles cast a warm glow throughout. A small group of local musicians tuned their instruments in one corner, while a table laden with food and drink occupied another. Isaac entered hesitantly, immediately feeling out of place among the festively dressed townspeople. He was considering a strategic retreat when Maggie appeared at his elbow. "You came," she said, genuine pleasure in her voice. "Said I might," he replied, drinking in the sight of her. The green dress suited her perfectly, emphasizing the blue of her eyes and the golden hue of her hair. "You look," she paused, seeming to search for the right word, "different. Without your trail dust and weathered expression." "Good different or bad different?" he asked, surprising himself with the lightness in his tone. Her smile deepened. "Decidedly good, though I've grown rather fond of both versions of Isaac Anderson." Before he could respond to this unexpected admission, Mrs. Bailey approached, practically beaming with satisfaction at seeing them together. "Isaac, so glad you decided to join our little celebration." And just in time, Miss Montgomery's students are about to perform the Christmas carols she's taught them. The evening progressed with a warmth Isaac hadn't experienced in years. Maggie's students performed admirably, their young voices rising sweetly in familiar carols. Food and drink were shared generously, and when the musicians struck up dancing tunes, the floor quickly filled with couples. Isaac stood to the side, content to watch until Maggie approached again. "Do you dance, Mr. Anderson?" she asked. "Been a long time," he admitted, "and never very well." She held out her hand. "Then it's fortunate I'm an excellent teacher." Something in her direct gaze challenged him, and Isaac found himself taking her hand and leading her onto the floor. His movements were stiff at first, but under Maggie's gentle guidance, he soon found the rhythm of the simple waltz. "See, not so terrible," she encouraged as they circled the floor. "The company improves the experience considerably," he replied, surprising himself again with his boldness. Maggie's eyes widened slightly, but her smile deepened. "I've missed our conversations, Isaac. Town life is pleasant enough, but I find myself thinking of those days in your cabin during the storm." "As have I," he admitted. "Cabin's too quiet now." The music slowed, and they found themselves standing closer than propriety strictly allowed. Isaac was acutely aware of every point where their bodies connected, his hand at her waist, hers resting lightly on his shoulder, their clasped hands creating a current of warmth between them. "I should warn you," Maggie said quietly, "people are watching and talking." Isaac glanced around, noting the speculative glances and whispered conversations. "Does that bother you?" She considered the question seriously. It should, a proper Boston lady would be mortified. A small smile played at her lips. "But I find I'm not that person anymore. The West changes you, doesn't it?" "That it does," Isaac agreed. "Usually for the harder." "Not always," she countered. "Sometimes it strips away pretense, leaves what's real." Their dance ended, but Isaac found reasons to remain near Maggie throughout the evening, fetching her punch, standing beside her as she conversed with townspeople, applauding her student's second performance. As the celebration began winding down, he found himself reluctant to see the night end. "Walk with me," he asked impulsively as Maggie bid good night to the Mercer family. She glanced at Mrs. Bailey, who was watching them with barely concealed interest. "It's rather cold outside." "Just to the church and back," he suggested. "I hear they've decorated it special for Christmas services." Maggie hesitated, then nodded. "Let me fetch my coat." The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant against the velvet black sky. Their breath formed clouds as they walked side by side down the main street, snow crunching beneath their boots. The small white church at the end of the street was indeed beautifully decorated, with candles in each window and a pine wreath on the door. "It's lovely," Maggie said, pausing to admire the simple building. "Reminds me that beauty can be found even in the most remote places." Isaac looked at her profile, illuminated by starlight and the distant glow from the hotel. "I'm beginning to learn that myself." She turned to face him, something vulnerable in her expression. "Isaac, may I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why did you really come to town? Was it just because of my letter?" Isaac considered how to answer truthfully. "Your letter gave me permission to do what I'd already been thinking about," he finally said. "I told myself I was coming to town to check on your welfare, but the truth is," he paused, gathering courage, "the truth is I couldn't stop thinking about you." Maggie's eyes widened, but she didn't look away. "I've been thinking about you too, more than is sensible." Sensible has never factored much into frontier life, Isaac said with a small smile. No, I suppose it hasn't. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the individual snowflakes landing on her eyelashes. What happens now, Isaac? It was a question loaded with possibilities and complications. The wagon train would return for her in spring. He had his solitary cabin and ranch work. They'd known each other barely 3 weeks. I don't know, he admitted. I just know that meeting you has changed something in me, made me question the walls I've built. I understand walls, Maggie said softly. After Father died, I built my own. Being proper, being independent, being strong, those became my walls. Her gloved hand reached up to touch his cheek. But when you found me by that wagon, something changed for me too. Isaac covered her hand with his own, holding it against his face. Maggie, I can't offer much. My cabin's small, my future uncertain. I don't need much, she interrupted. Just, she hesitated, then finished in a rush, just someone who sees me as I am, not as circumstance has made me. The honesty in her words struck Isaac like a physical blow. How long had he defined himself by loss and solitude rather than by the man he truly was or could become? Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he bent his head toward hers. Their lips met in a kiss as gentle as the falling snow around them, brief but filled with promise. When they parted, Maggie's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if memorizing the sensation. When she opened them, her smile was radiant despite the blush staining her cheeks. We should return to the hotel, she said softly, before Mrs. Bailey sends out a search party. Isaac offered his arm and she took it, walking beside him through the silent, snow-covered street. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with new understanding. At the hotel steps, Maggie paused. Will you be returning to your cabin tomorrow? I'd planned to, Isaac admitted, but now I'm reconsidering. The Mercers have invited me for Christmas dinner, she said. They specifically mentioned that I might bring a friend if I wished. Her eyes met his, questioning. I'd be honored, Isaac replied, though I can't promise my table manners are up to Boston standards. Maggie laughed, the sound bright in the cold night air. Mr. Anderson, I believe you underestimate yourself in many regards. He raised her gloved hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Miss Montgomery. Sleep well. Good night, Isaac. As he watched her disappear into the hotel, Isaac felt a strange lightness in his chest, as if a burden he'd carried for years had begun to lift. The frontier hadn't changed. It was still harsh, unforgiving, demanding. But his place within it, his understanding of what it meant to survive here, was transforming with each moment spent in Maggie's company. The next morning, Isaac woke to the sounds of Leavenworth coming to life, shopkeepers clearing snow from boardwalks, wagons creaking down the main street, children's voices calling to one another. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, where Mrs. Bailey was serving breakfast to her few guests. Sleep well? She asked with a knowing smile as she poured his coffee. Well enough, Isaac replied noncommittally. Miss Montgomery was up at dawn, Mrs. Bailey continued, clearly fishing for information. Said she needed to check on her wagon before the next snow. She watched Isaac's reaction carefully. Isaac set down his coffee cup. Her wagon. Alone? Mrs. Bailey nodded, borrowed a horse from the livery. Said she'd be back by midday. Concern immediately replaced Isaac's morning contentment. The trail to the abandoned wagon was difficult in good conditions. With recent snowfall and the possibility of another storm approaching, it was downright dangerous for someone unfamiliar with the territory. How long ago did she leave? He demanded, already standing. Not an hour past, Mrs. Bailey replied, looking slightly alarmed at his reaction. She seemed quite determined. Isaac was out the door within minutes, saddling Thunder and packing basic emergency supplies. He knew Maggie was capable. She'd survived alone by that wagon for 3 days before he'd found her. But the December weather was unpredictable and the terrain treacherous. The trail was relatively easy to follow despite fresh snow. The livery horse had left clear tracks heading west out of town. Isaac urged Thunder to a faster pace, worry gnawing at him with each passing mile. What could be so important at that wagon that Maggie would risk traveling alone? He found her exactly where he feared, at the abandoned wagon, struggling to dig through snow that had drifted against its side. She looked up at his approach, surprise giving way to embarrassment on her face. "Isaac, what are you doing here?" He dismounted quickly, relief making his voice sharper than intended. "What am I doing? What are you doing, coming out here alone with a storm threatening?" Maggie straightened, brushing snow from her coat. "I needed to retrieve something important." Her chin lifted slightly. "I'm perfectly capable of making this journey alone." "Capable isn't the question," Isaac said, moderating his tone. "It's about unnecessary risk. This weather can turn deadly in minutes." She looked away. "I know, it's just, Christmas is approaching and she hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I wanted to get something for you." Isaac's irritation evaporated. "For me?" Maggie nodded, gesturing to the partially excavated side of the wagon. "It's in that trunk, my father's books, one in particular I thought you might appreciate." Understanding dawned. "You risked this journey for a book." "As a gift for me." "It sounds foolish when you put it that way," she admitted, a flush rising to her cheeks. "But yes, after last night, after everything, I wanted you to have something meaningful. Not just any book, Father's copy of Thoreau's Walden, about a man who finds meaning in solitude, yet learns the value of human connection." She looked up at him, vulnerability in her eyes. "It reminded me of you." Isaac stood speechless, moved beyond words by the gesture. No one had given him a gift in years, let alone one chosen with such personal consideration. "Maggie, he stopped, overcome by emotion. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate." Her smile was tentative. "You're not angry anymore." "I was never angry," he clarified, "just worried." He moved to the wagon and began clearing snow with renewed purpose. "Now let's find this book and get back to town before that storm hits." Together, they uncovered the trunk and located the leather-bound volume. Maggie held it reverently before placing it in Isaac's saddlebag. "It survived the journey this far," she said, "like us." The parallel wasn't lost on Isaac. He helped Maggie mount her borrowed horse, then swung up onto Thunder. As they prepared to ride back to town, he reached across to take her hand. "I don't have a gift for you," he said, "nothing prepared." Maggie's gloved fingers squeezed his. "You found me when I was lost, sheltered me when I had nowhere, treated me with respect when I was vulnerable." Her eyes met his, clear and direct. "Those are gifts beyond measure, Isaac Anderson." The ride back to Leavenworth was taken at a careful pace, with the threatened storm holding off just long enough for them to reach town safely. That evening, sitting before the fire in the hotel's common room, Isaac opened Maggie's gift and read the inscription her father had written on the flyleaf. "To find oneself, one must sometimes get lost." "It seems particularly fitting now," Maggie observed, watching him trace the faded ink with his finger. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," Isaac said. "He was, I think he would have liked you." Her expression grew thoughtful. "What will you do after Christmas, Isaac?" "Return to your cabin." The question hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Isaac closed the book carefully, considering his answer. "I should. The ranch will need hands for winter feeding soon." He paused, then added, "But I find myself reluctant to return to that solitude." Maggie nodded slowly. "And I find myself questioning whether continuing to Oregon in spring is what I truly want." The common room was empty save for them, the late hour granting a privacy that encouraged honesty. Isaac turned to face her fully. "What do you want, Maggie, if you could choose without obligation or expectation?" She met his gaze steadily. "I want purpose, connection, a place where my education means something." Her voice softened. "And I find myself wanting your company far more than I should admit." Isaac reached for her hand, holding it between both of his. "I've been thinking. The Double Diamond needs a schoolteacher for the rancher's children. 5 families with young ones, all living too far from town for regular schooling." He hesitated, then continued, They've talked about building a proper schoolhouse come spring. The ranch owner's wife mentioned it last time I was there. Maggie's eyes widened. You think they would hire me? I know they would. Educated teachers are rare out here, and you've already proven yourself with the town children. And you, she asked softly, where would you be? Right where I am now, working cattle for the Double Diamond. My cabin's on their northern range. He squeezed her hand gently, not so far from where they'd build the schoolhouse. Understanding bloomed in Maggie's expression, close enough for regular visits. Close enough to court properly, Isaac clarified, surprising himself with his boldness. If that's something you might consider. Maggie's free hand came up to touch his face, her palm warm against his cheek. Isaac Anderson, I would consider that very seriously indeed. The days leading to Christmas passed in a swirl of activity. Isaac rode out to the Double Diamond's main house to speak with the owner, Mr. Richardson, about Maggie's qualifications. As he'd predicted, Richardson was enthusiastic about the prospect of hiring a Boston-educated teacher for the ranch children. His wife even more so. We'll need to build that schoolhouse sooner rather than later, Richardson declared. Could use your help with that, Anderson, come spring thaw. Be happy to assist, Isaac replied, already envisioning the structure and the teacher who would bring it to life. When he returned to town with the news, Maggie's delight confirmed what he'd already begun to suspect. Her heart was aligning with his own, finding home in this unexpected connection. Christmas Day arrived clear and cold, with sunshine glinting off pristine snow. The church service was well attended, with Maggie's students performing carols once more. Isaac sat beside her in the small white church, conscious of the glances and smiles directed their way, no longer concerned with town gossip. Dinner at the Mercers was a boisterous affair, with their 4 children peppering Maggie with questions about Boston and Isaac with questions about ranch life. Mrs. Mercer, a kind-faced woman with practical ways, took Isaac aside after the meal. Miss Montgomery is a fine young woman, she said without preamble. Best thing to happen to this town in years. Those children at the Double Diamond are fortunate to get her. I agree, Isaac said simply. Mrs. Mercer eyed him shrewdly. And I suspect she's the best thing to happen to you in quite some time as well. Isaac couldn't deny it, she is. Good. About time you stopped hiding out in that cabin of yours. She patted his arm approvingly. Life's too short and the West too harsh to face it alone. The wisdom in her words stayed with Isaac, as he and Maggie walked back to the hotel through the gathering twilight. Snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting lazily from a darkening sky. I should head back to the ranch tomorrow, Isaac said reluctantly. Mr. Richardson needs help with the winter feeding. Maggie nodded, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. And I should prepare for my new position. Mrs. Richardson invited me to visit after New Year's to discuss the curriculum. They stopped at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country. In the distance, mountains rose against the horizon, their snow-covered peaks merging with clouds. It won't be easy, Isaac said, turning to face her. The winter's long, the work hard. That schoolhouse won't be ready until spring at earliest. I know, Maggie's expression was serene, confident. But I've discovered something about myself since being left behind by that wagon train, Isaac. I'm stronger than I knew. More adaptable than I believed. She stepped closer, her face tilted up to his, and far braver than I ever had reason to be in Boston. Isaac marveled at the woman before him, not just her beauty, which was considerable, but her resilience, her intelligence, her willingness to forge a new path. In the month since finding her by that abandoned wagon, she had transformed his understanding of connection, of possibility, of home. Maggie Montgomery, he said quietly, I believe you may be the greatest Christmas gift I've ever received. Her smile rivaled the stars just beginning to appear overhead. And you, Isaac Anderson, are the answer to a prayer I didn't know I was making when that wagon train left me behind. As snowflakes danced around them, Isaac drew Maggie into his arms and kissed her, no longer tentatively, but with the certainty of a man who had found something worth changing for. The walls he'd built after his parents' deaths, the solitude he'd convinced himself was safer, the belief that attachment meant vulnerability, all were giving way to a new truth. That love, far from being a luxury the frontier couldn't afford, might be the very thing that made its harshness bearable. When spring arrived, bringing green to the valley and warmth to the air, Isaac helped raise the schoolhouse on Double Diamond land, just as he'd promised. The ranch families gathered for the occasion, turning labor into celebration as the simple building took shape under their combined efforts. Maggie watched from the shade of a nearby cottonwood, her students clustered around her as she used the construction as an impromptu mathematics lesson. Her gaze frequently drifted to Isaac, who worked alongside the other men with a quiet competence that had earned him respect throughout the territory. The past months had seen changes for both of them. Maggie had written to the Wilkersons in Oregon, thanking them for their concern, but releasing them from their obligation to retrieve her. Isaac had expanded his cabin, adding a second room and proper windows that let in the mountain light. And on Sundays, when Maggie rode out to teach at remote homesteads too far from the schoolhouse, Isaac often accompanied her, the two of them traveling side by side across the awakening landscape. As the schoolhouse neared completion, with only the roof remaining, Isaac climbed down from the framework and approached Maggie, wiping sweat from his brow. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing to the structure. "Will it suit your teaching needs, Miss Montgomery?" Maggie dismissed her students to help carry water to the workers, then turned to Isaac with a smile that still made his heart race after all these months. "It's perfect, Mr. Anderson." She reached for his hand, no longer concerned with who might be watching. "Though I've been thinking about something else entirely." "Have you now?" Isaac's thumb traced circles on her palm. "Would it have anything to do with that question I asked you last week?" Her cheeks colored slightly at the reference to his marriage proposal, delivered on a hillside overlooking the valley as spring's first wildflowers bloomed around them. "It might," she admitted. "I was thinking that a June wedding would be lovely, after the schoolhouse is finished, before summer work demands too much of your time." Isaac pulled her gently into his arms, propriety be damned. "June sounds perfect." Over his shoulder, Maggie could see the schoolhouse taking shape, a symbol of the community she'd found, the purpose she'd discovered. Beyond it stood the mountains that had once seemed so formidable, but now framed the home she was building. "Who would have thought," she murmured against Isaac's shoulder, "that being left behind would lead me exactly where I needed to be?" Isaac held her closer, remembering that snowy December day when he'd found an abandoned wagon and the woman who would change his life. "Sometimes," he said, "the best journeys are the ones we never planned to take." As children's laughter rang across the valley and hammers continued their rhythmic work on the schoolhouse roof, Isaac and Maggie stood together in the spring sunshine, no longer alone, no longer lost, having found in each other the home they both had sought across the wild frontier.